Welcome to the Spawn Chunks, episode number 221 for Monday, November 28th, 2022. My name is Johnny, but the internet knows me as Pixelriffs, and joining me as always is my good friend Joel Duggan. Hi, Joel.
Hello, and if you would like to hear a bit more about Pokemon Violet, or Scarlet, or both, in the render distance, you can do that by going to patreon.com/thespawnchunks. Supporting at any level will get you access to the extended version of the podcast. I also got a chance to meet a couple of the community members over the weekend, and I talked about that in the render distance as well. You can also, as a patron, get the monthly Minecraft Hangout for November, which we recorded on, published on Saturday. That is out on the RSS feed for patrons. And you can stay tuned for the December schedule adjustments. That will include when and if we're doing a hangout for December, because later in the month, of course, is closer to Christmas, which is normally where we do the hangouts. But also, Johnny and I tend to record a couple of episodes ahead of time so that we can have a Christmas break and visit family. So keep in on the Discord channels for updates on the schedule for the Spawn Chunks.
Let's check in about our Minecraft lives, Joel. What's new with you on the Citadel?
I have completed another area on the Citadel, and I'm very happy about it because it did not take very long. I have been working on, I guess, a series of things that I just kind of decided were builds between builds. I was working on everything between the inn and between the barracks, I guess, the North Barracks. And it's been a lot of fun. I have been working on a Fletcher, so kind of like a shop and a house where the person, I guess, building or making or selling the bows and arrows and stuff was living, but also selling the goods. And then we also have the kind of the dwelling, next door, and then alleyways that kind of like snake in and around. I had a storehouse. Stairs that go up to the towers, both outside and inside. Little happy accidents like putting together the barracks bunkhouse where a bunch of wall guards or soldiers might sleep, and then realizing, oh, I could just put a hole in the wall and they can walk right into the tower without having to go outside, which I thought was kind of cool. And then the last little bit was another kind of like storage shed that acted again as access to one of the building towers. But then once all these little bits were done, including a practice yard outside the barracks bunkhouse where, I had a bunch of like hay bale dummies set up, and was able to use the data pack that I have to like have like an axe embedded in a hay bale and arrows sticking out of the target block. So it looked like someone had left their arrows in the target block, stuff like that. And after all those details were finished, I was able to go through with everything done on either side. I could texture the path. I could add little greenery bits here and there. Really happy with a small custom tree that I threw in just like next to a staircase, because like everything was feeling very gray and I needed to add in some things to break it up. And anytime I could add some color, I would. And one of the other things that I thought was a fun little trick, I guess, was using 3 trapdoors, waterlogging the bottom one, and then making it look like a barrel that was collecting rain was then being siphoned down the wall into a cauldron at the bottom by using cobblestone walls. It looks kind of like a pipe, like a gutter pipe. So all kinds of little details like that. They were the kind of projects that would be finished within a stream. We'd move on to another section. I'd finish the bunkhouse, move on to another section. And then the last stream on Sunday was just like kind of going back and forth over the area and just kind of like tweaking little things, changing the texture of the ground, moving a bush, adding in custom tree roots. Or my favorite trick in some of these smaller paths is to use a stair block at the edge of the path when there's a lot of greenery around it. So it kind of makes the path look a little bit more narrow and a little bit more chiseled away. So all that kind of stuff really came together, and I'm really happy with it. So I'm moving on to one of the larger builds in the area that still is like just like roof scaffolding that keeps on showing up in my screenshots as an eyesore, because like it's the only roof that's not done.
That's motivation. That's how you get yourself motivated to do stuff. It's like, oh, I could take a good picture from this angle, but I still haven't finished that. Well, dang it, I have to finish that build now.
And in some of the screenshots, you can see my rainbow of shulker boxes that's in the alleyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm trying to move those. Well, they're going to stay there for a while because the house I have to build is right next to them. So like, there's no point in moving them. It's so convenient right now to just move and build that other thing. So I'm down to the process now of like, I don't know what else to add. Like, there's a couple more places that need houses. I guess they're just going to be houses. They don't have to be any kind of like shop or any kind of theme. I think I just have to make them a different color, or for me, it's probably going to be more like I should probably try to make something round or make something with a different shape that I'm normally doing. So we'll see how it goes. But I'm looking forward to getting to the point where I'm on the final check boxes of like, running through the whole town and making sure all the insides of houses are done, making sure I haven't forgotten any road texture. The road texture thing is I've been saving it to last because you want to make sure that everything on either side is finished before you start messing with the road.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, for sure. I love the fact that you're kind of running out of stuff to do in a way, and like that's a sign that you've really exhausted the stuff that Minecraft naturally gives you, because we think of starter bases and stuff like that. Sometimes you'll build a house that you do the brewing stuff in, and a house that maybe like belongs to somebody who manages food, and that's where you keep all your food. And instead of having a centralized storage system or a centralized base where everything gets done in one room, you tend to split stuff up for the sake of having different houses. But once you run out of those things, you're really having to innovate and think about the lore of the world, and like trying to piece together what other occupations and vocations are required for the area that you live in. On my kind of Christmas list right now, whenever anyone's like, what should I buy you? And I'm like, I don't know, I'm 35. Like, it's kind of difficult to come up with ideas. I read a thread the other day from somebody who specializes in designing video game environments, and specifically cities. And I'll try and find a link to this Twitter thread because it was a great list of books to study if you're interested in city building. And there was so much about infrastructure and grids and variations on grids and how modern cities are planned and histories of specific cities. And then his own book, the one that he was promoting as a result of this whole thread, really, was a book about video game environments specifically. And I want to read all of those now, because when I run up against a wall like this, where it's like, I don't know what to add to a city project, or I don't know how to start planning a city project in the first place, I think we can learn so much from examples from the real world and histories of how those things have built up over time.
Oh, for sure. And I've definitely made some mistakes in terms of like the location choice and trying not to change the landscape and trying to go with the way that the natural riverscape went. And there are definitely some odd shapes, and it doesn't seem like from above it looks very odd. There's a very strange kind of like bulb at the bottom where I've kind of like forced the wall around the church, and like because I just kind of got myself into a corner. It's like, well, I don't know what to do. And so I think there's a bunch of different things that could be changed in that light. I still have a long way to go. I've got some outside stuff I have to do, like bridges and farms and things like that. But that'll be a nice break too, because those are a little bit easier to do a bridge that's not next to anything, because then you can just make it be whatever you want. You don't have to blend it in with the surroundings. But
especially with you having gone from a large project to several smaller projects, and now you're going back to a larger project, I think it's a nice way of pacing yourself, just to make sure that some of those little things that you're like, I'm confident enough in my abilities that I can knock that out in an afternoon or a couple of streams or whatever it happens to be. Like, I think it's important to keep a couple of those in your back pocket in case you get burnt out on building like a castle keep or a big house or a church or whatever it happens to be, you know?
Yeah, the keep is something that I built very early on, and the inside is not done because I think subconsciously I just wasn't happy with the outside.
Yeah.
And I definitely want to make it feel more robust. It's big, but there are other things now, and I've gotten so much better at building in the medieval style that I think, I should just like take the top. I like the bottom part, but I could take the top off the keep. I can probably add another floor to it of stone and then start getting into some other stuff, and have like a couple of different towers on towers, lean a little bit more into the fantasy side of things than the medieval, because it is supposed to be a medieval fantasy town, and have it be a little bit more hanging over the river, and definitely something you can see for miles and miles and miles. Whereas right now you can see that it's the tallest thing, but it's only the tallest thing by a little bit, not by leaps and bounds. And I kind of want to emphasize that a little bit more. And there's also a bunch of data pack stuff inside the keep that has stopped working because it's an old version, so I have to kind of do a once through there anyway. The thing that I'm looking forward to but will take the longest is going to be going through the streets, texturing the streets, but then also adding the things like a hay wagon or like stuff on the side of the road,
Signs of
or
life, yeah.
yeah, like that kind of stuff. Like maybe even a market stall thing that just kind of unique to the area. That kind of stuff is just going to take a while, and it's the kind of thing you can't really plan. You just kind of have to walk back and forth and go like, this needs something there, this needs something there. It's something that I'm used to from trying to finish a drawing. You know, like you're working on an art piece and you've got it all colored, and it's like it still needs something. You're trying to mess around and trying to figure out what it is that it's missing, and it takes a little while. And ultimately, I just have to wait until I'm satisfied. And I know that I'm a perfectionist, and I can let myself noodle at things a little bit too much. So that's why it's, as you said, nice to have these smaller things where rather than getting caught up for weeks, you can just be like, no, this is something that will not take that long because the path is only 2 blocks wide. Like there's only so much texture you can put into that before it starts to look noisy, and you just have to walk away. So it's been a good exercise, and I'm looking forward to what's next. I'm going to have to like re-educate my Minecraft brain if I wanted to go back to the modern city or build something else. I'm going to have to like, my Pinterest board is going to have to change dramatically because I'm just like, I don't even know. But that reminds me of what you said about architecture. Like I might look into getting an architecture book for modern architecture, like for new buildings, stuff like that.
Yeah, at least for photo reference, I think stuff like that is invaluable, and we can get plenty of photo reference from like Google and whatnot. But I think there's so much to be learned from a little bit of extra context that gets applied to it from it being in a big old chunky textbook, or at least like a nicely presented photo book for sure.
Yeah, I'm more interested in the why, as like behind the how does it look? Like I want to know why the staircase is all on one side of a building, or like, you know, because it's either fire regulations or it makes for the living spaces to be less cut up, like all that kind of stuff. Like I want to know more about that. So what have you been up to in Minecraft?
I've actually been avoiding city building entirely. I've avoided my base for the last week. And so I've been working a bit more on the Wither Skeleton farm. It now has a second spawning platform, and the platform is 3 crossroads worth of a nether fortress, so it's very effective now. I added a couple of little optimizations using Skulk sensors to detect the sound of the Wither Skeletons falling down into the farm, and that kind of activates the piston that pushes them on into the next section. Worked with my Twitch chat on a couple of those. They had some very good suggestions about how to respond to some of the stuff that was doing, where the jams were occurring when too many skeletons got caught up in one place. So I was optimizing that a little. But the reason I've been avoiding my base is that one of the visitors to the server, Cubfan, decided to embark on a bit of a story thing where he's become possessed by the Skulk, and he went around the entire server, at least the populated areas of the server, leaving Skulk catalysts under the ground. And what happened as a result was that a bunch of areas of the server, including my base, became infested with Skulk very quickly, because it wasn't just situations where a player would kill a mob and the mob would leave Skulk everywhere. It happens in occasions when the mob wouldn't normally drop XP. We think of Skulk as being tied to XP, but if a skeleton or a zombie burns in the sun, for example, still spreads the Skulk. And, them dying from fall damage would do the same thing. So passive means of them dying were still triggering all of these Skulk catalysts. And so that story arc is in the process of being resolved. The videos are coming out today and tomorrow, I think. So we're already done with it as far as the actual server goes. But I didn't want to spend too much time at my base because a bunch of mobs were dying around there if I went underground to refill my copper aging machine and that kind of stuff. So when I come back to the surface, it would have a night would have already passed. It would be the next day, and then zombies and stuff would be burning, and the Skulk would be spreading everywhere. But luckily, having Light Matica on this server has proved another solution to this problem, because while it's fun for the sake of a story, but the cleanup is kind of awkward to deal with if you can't find the Skulk catalysts immediately. You're effectively just having to paper over it all with fresh grass and stone and whatnot, and having built with natural blocks a lot of the time. I'm building with natural stone for some of my buildings that have been there for a while, and the detail has worn out of them over time. So I end up with a lot of those building blocks getting converted into Skulk. And chat over this weekend, Twitch chat, taught me how to use the material verifier in Light Matica, which what that does is if you superimpose your schematic over the area that you are building in, it's basically a way of having it check which blocks are missing from the schematic and which ones are wrong, and just highlighting those blocks. And so all I needed to do was update the schematic of an area. Like I took a giant box schematic of my base, and I changed what block to look for in terms of the Skulk catalyst. I changed that to a dirt block, and so all of the Skulk catalysts would appear as incorrect blocks in a schematic of the whole area. And the good thing about that is that you can see the schematic stuff through the ground, and so I was able to effectively highlight where all of the Skulk catalysts were and go and dig them up systematically instead of worrying about all of the trial and error digging for them.
Wow,
so
that's nice.
Yeah, it's really, really helpful thing. So I'm now going to start selling that as a service to everybody else on the server who's been afflicted with the same thing. But obviously, like as part of a story, it was kind of a fun challenge. But yeah, people were not wrong when they said that when Cub starts like grinding on something and gets an idea in his head, he takes it to an extreme. There were, I think, two shulker boxes worth of Skulk catalysts farmed from like a warden farm that were placed throughout the server. They're in the nether, they're in the end, they're all over people's bases. And it's the kind of thing that I think his intention was that this stuff would kind of pop up every so often, and it would be this kind of thing that, you know, we're shaking our hands at the sky and going, Cub fan, every time we see a Skulk thing pop up. But the reality was it spread really fast, because we're all online right now getting stuff done and doing projects, and we can't always sleep as soon as it reaches nighttime. So we ended up with the Skulk spreading, I think, a lot faster than anybody expected it to.
Kija in our chat is saying 3,240 Skulk catalysts placed.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's not long if you're AFKing at a warden farm. Like that's pretty easy to get hold of with, you know, a couple of days. Going around and placing them must have been a heck of an effort. But then
that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like but there's we need a new word. Like there's pranked and then there's cubbed.
Yeah, I mean, there's and the thing about this one is like it's if it weren't for the fact that it's Cub and we do all of this stuff for story and, you know, for videos and stuff, this is just griefing at this point.
Yeah,
like it's very borderline, and a lot of folks in the community have been like side-eyeing this and going, "Is this okay?" And like, obviously, I want to stress that it's all in good fun, and we have, as you can see from the Lightmatica example, some very sophisticated ways of getting hold of that stuff. But you also don't want to see stuff like that popping up on servers where people think it's okay because somebody on YouTube has been doing this. It's like, we're all people who play Minecraft full time. We have the luxury of being able to, you know, figure out ways of managing stuff like this. But what it led to in the first instance was Joe Hills, who's been helping me work on the museum stuff and is building like a security system because somebody else recently broke in and stole one of my exhibits, right, in the story of the thing. He was around there quite a lot, and he was there when the Skulk started spreading. And so he dug up a bunch of the paths around my base trying to find where the Skulk catalysts were placed. And he was mostly digging up grass blocks, so it was nice and easy to put them back. But I returned to my base looking like it had been shelled because there was just like dug up earthworks everywhere and stuff. And yeah, it's the kind of thing that it's a fun distraction, and it makes for some different content when normally what I would be doing was building. But it's also like a week's worth of stuff that I was thinking, what should I build next? I can work on some stuff. Wait, suddenly I'm putting out fires everywhere.
Yeah, it's funny. I find it interesting the combination of like the effort that goes into these extra things that aren't builds, you know, the things that are events. We'll call them server events. And sometimes that involves building something, but a lot of the times it's more about collecting the resources, doing the thing. And I think another really good one was like the Hermitron Go that I think Ren did a few seasons ago, where you had to go around and collect stuff. Like that's just really fun, but it's a lot of work because the prizes have to be worth it, and the prizes have to be collected. And these things, it's not like you're just placing a shulker box somewhere. Like it had to be covered in glass, and it had to look a certain color, and sometimes it had to be hidden. Like that kind of stuff takes a lot of effort, and I am always like flattened by just how much time folks are able to put into things like that. But then on the other side too, I also admire the exploitative nature of SMP servers that are usually YouTube based, because like you've discovered this great way to rid your area of the Skulk. And instead of just telling other people, this is how you could do it. It's like, I'll do it for you for a fee. Eyebrow wiggle. Like,
yeah. No, I put it to them that way in the Discord. I said, I can I can teach a man to fish, or you could just pay me for the fish, and that would be fine. And they're like, yeah, no, we'll be fine paying you for this, I think.
Yeah.
Speaking of Rendog, actually, one of his latest kind of collector ups is specifically targeted at me, where he's got his first, 13 significant items, like his first wooden pickaxe, his first piece of cobblestone that he mined with that. He's basically saved all of those and renamed them like they're a collectible set, and then he sold one of them to basically every other empire, and so I've got to go and buy them back so that I can get them for my museum. And so now, I effectively owe everybody a favor or something so that I can have the full set, and I think my favor is probably going to be getting rid of the Skulk for them. So it all, it ties itself up in a very neat package at the end of the day. And it's kind of fun to be able to connect the dots and throw together all of this. And none of that has really been planned in advance between Carbon Ren and everybody else. It's just the stuff that happens spontaneously as a result of working with these creative people with too much time on their hands.
Nice.
Let's move on into today's news. We have Minecraft Java Edition 119.3, pre-release 1 and 2, both of which were released during the week. We'll have links to the changelog over at minecraft.net. They share a changelog because one is just an iteration on the other. So as far as 119.3 pre-release 1 goes, there are a few technical changes, adding new entity sub-predicate types for axolotls, boats, foxes, mushrooms, paintings, rabbits, horses, llamas, villagers, parrots, and tropical fish. More information about those can be found on the changelog article. And I don't want to explain it here because it's a very technical thing that I'm not sure I fully understand. But basically, you can split up each of the entities based on their different varieties, like the different types of axolotls, the different materials of boats, that kind of thing, and apply stuff to those specifically. There's also now a fill biome command which supports a filtered mode, and a little bit more about that in a second. We also have player heads now containing a note block sound field. When present, this determines the sound a note block makes when the head is placed on top of it. So as an expansion for the mob heads idea with note blocks that we discussed in a previous episode, now player heads can be imbued with different sounds using commands and data packs and that kind of thing. Fixed bugs of note in 119.3 pre-release 1 include villager pathfinding being broken in water. That's now been fixed. Certain mobs also couldn't get out of water that was at least 2 blocks deep. Some pathfinding issues with axolotls that commonly hesitated when avoiding danger and occasionally started pathfinding into dangerous directions. And baby piglins and zombified piglins taking damage when they hit their head on a block. All of those and more have been fixed. Once again, the changelog in our show notes is where to go for the full list of bug fixes. Moving on to pre-release 2, the changes in 119.3 pre-release 2 include when tabbing through buttons, tooltips are displayed above and below them, so a good accessibility feature for folks not using a mouse as frequently. Tooltips displayed when hovering are displayed next to the cursor. Tooltips from focused buttons, focused by pressing tab, take priority over tooltips from hovered buttons, and they've optimized some exceptionally slow cases of structure lookup. A few more fixed bugs of note in pre-release 2 include bees getting stuck on non-full blocks, creepers could not be ignited with a fire charge previously, and some shorter mobs could still attack players on camels. There are a handful of other bugs there, but we just wanted to pick out a few of the ones that made sense to us more than anything else. But that is it as far as the pre-releases go. They are still targeting, I believe, December 6th for the release of 119.3. And it's important not to confuse that with the release of Minecraft 1.20. So we're going to commit a little bit of our main discussion this week to talking about the differences between those.
I do find it funny that some of the shorter mobs were attacking players on camels, and that would be the opposite of what you would think. You would think it would be the taller mobs that could still reach you.
Yes,
but
yeah.
it'd be very odd experience when the zombie would come up and not be able to reach you, but a baby zombie would be able to hit you.
Yeah, the baby zombie just kind of jumps up and attacks your ankles in the stirrups.
Yeah, and I'm surprised and happy that they have not added any kind of jumping mob like that. Like, I'm glad that baby zombies don't leap at you because they're already fast enough. I don't need them to be airborne.
One of my first thoughts when they introduced the camel and they said zombie height mobs can't reach you, I thought, okay, so you can just sit in the nether on a camel and have a bunch of zombie pigmen come up to you. And It turns out that when you hit them with a sword, they get up in your hitbox because they take a little bit of they get a bit of extra height when they are knocked back by the sword. So you really need to have a knockback enchanted sword for it to be effective. Otherwise, they leap up and hit you before you can react to them, which is always a little bit hectic.
Yeah, so you got to push them back out of the melee range, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. You can't risk colliding with them because they hit very hard. So the player head sounds change is really cool. Great for folks who don't mind working with data packs and other custom features. I think I saw a Zoomer's video on this. He had some really good examples of just, sound files that he'd either got from the game's code, like just looking up sound effects the way you would with a vanilla command block, or you could import them using a resource pack and a data pack and have your own custom sound effects applied to it, kind of in the same way they've been doing with goat horns and music discs on Hermitcraft Season 9. So there's some really neat applications of that, and I'm going to talk a bit in the main discussion about introducing more ambience and more soundscape into builds, so this is another really interesting way of doing that.
I can see a lot of really cool stuff for either RP or just server silliness. Like if you wanted to have, if you've got a sound bite that is particularly funny, particularly if you're a content creator, like if you've said something silly, like you've mispronounced a word and it becomes a thing,
you've got a
like
catchphrase or whatever,
catchphrase, in joke, something like that. I think that could be very, very fun. I mean, I don't know, because it's so stationary. The goat horn thing, at least you can bring it with you. Whereas with this, you'd have to bring like the player head and the note block, and you have to power it and like all that kind of stuff. So there's a little bit more involved. But I can see it for things like mini games. Like I think about Tango Tech and Hermitcraft that has the different mini games that he does, and having a custom sound, being able to make something feel spooky. Especially if you're not in a particularly spooky biome. Like if you're not in the Nether that has creepy noises, but you want creepy noises, you could even just like take Nether noises and assign them to a player head. And then you could have like that basalt kind of crackle and creepy ambiance that happens in the Nether, but then have it happen in your evil kingdom tower, or whatever it is that you're building. I like the flexibility. It involves a little bit more, behind the scenes stuff, but I think having player heads and having already things assigned to heads and a functionality in game, like the skeletons and the creepers and the zombies that we got in the last snapshot, I think that gives slightly easier access. Like having a simple resource pack that you apply that has the sound for a player head that changes it, or any other mob, is a lot easier for the average person to implement than it is to do like command blocks or data packs and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I can imagine there being some really good like vanilla tweaks packs for this as well before long, like ones that go along with the more mob heads data packs, so that every mob head that you can acquire gets you the sound effects for that mob and not just the skeleton, zombie, dragon, the ones that are native to vanilla Minecraft. So yeah, there's lots of really cool stuff that you can do with that. Sheepscalibur in our live chat is saying that Slice Lime has some very good examples. I tuned into Slice Lime this week for one of the other things that's covered in this changelog, which is playing around with the fill biome command, and he was filtering it by a set of categories that he had predefined, I think, using a custom-coded data pack of his own creation, where he was filtering by seasons. And so when he was adjusting the look of a forest, he could apply a fall forest season to that, and it would automatically adjust the biome so that it had the biome colors of something like a savanna, where the leaves became more yellow, and you could apply badlands to that a little bit as well, so you could make the leaves look more dead. And there were some really interesting ways of doing it. And obviously that's like, oh, they're adding seasons to Minecraft now. Probably not, but I think there's a really neat way of allowing players to mess around with that stuff without having to learn entire new external tools. It's the type of thing that World Edit would be used for most prominently, and this feels like a pretty significant change to allow players that level of customization from within vanilla without the use of community-made tools like that.
I can see it being a really good tool for just workflow, for map makers, even just creative players that are just treating Minecraft like a canvas and just want to, you've got this one area, like I've got it right now, like I've got a taiga biome and a sunflower plains biome that connect within my town, and I have to be very careful, and I have to change the kind of bushes that I decorate the paths with, because once I get into the taiga biome, the grass is mint green and nothing else goes with it. Or if I'm using azalea bushes that don't change with the biome, I have to switch up to something like mangrove, which has been great because mangrove is a great new block that does change with the biome. But like that kind of thing, having control over that, if it was something that you were doing a map for, or even if it's just something as like you've just put in so much work into a big build only to realize that there's like a desert or something that you didn't realize crept across a river, and now you like your one custom tree in your magical courtyard is brown because it's in a desert.
Yeah.
Just, you could just use this feature to just paint the desert back by a dozen blocks, and then you're fine. Problem resolved. Having these tools, I think, is great for people that are okay with stepping outside the survival vanilla gameplay and just like fixing things that are just making their eyes twitch. Or, as I said, map makers and content creators in that light, I think, are also enjoying these technical changes across the board. Like not just the biome fill tool, but then also all the different variants and sub predicates that you mentioned in the notes as well.
Yeah, definitely. Honestly, like thinking back to my one chunk builds days, I would have used a fill biome command if it existed in vanilla to try and emulate the desert foliage colors and stuff for a desert build instead of building it all in a creative flat world where everything was a plains biome and not having any variation in that, and then having to remember that, oh wait, the different leaves are going to be different colors, so I can't build with something that looks lush and green if it's oak leaves, because when players build this in a desert, the leaves are going to look brown. So I think there's a lot of flexibility in that feels like it should have been there for a while, but I think it's a great thing that it's there now.
Are we ready for some email?
I think we are, yes. Let's move on to chunk mail.
If you would like to email the show, you can send that into spawnchunkmail@gmail.com. Please keep them short and sweet. It increases the chances of getting on the show. This email is from Imperfect. The subject is tuned note blocks with heads. Hi, Pixel Riffs and Joel. I just listened to the most recent episode, and one of the things that stood out to me was this concept of tuning note blocks with heads on them. I personally don't mess with note blocks that much because tuning them is a real pain with the mechanic of cycling back around if you misclick. I like the idea of note block playing different sound effects by tuning them, and I am now wondering whether note blocks need a GUI so players can tune them more easily, or if I'm only the one that thinks this would be useful. I used to think that chiseled bookshelves needed a GUI too, but now that we've got targeted slots, I don't see the need for a bookshelf GUI anymore. So maybe note blocks could have a similar mechanic? I'm curious as to what creative mechanic you guys can come up with. Imperfect was blown up by a creeper while trying to tune his creeper note block.
Yeah, I think
The
a lot of
irony is
people,
real.
a lot of people are going to be doing that. I have a feeling. This is certainly a topic we've touched on before. I'm pretty sure we've talked about a note block GUI idea in the past, but yeah, we may as well rehash that because it's been a while, to my recollection.
It is something that we have talked about, and I knew that when I picked this email. However, what I liked about the idea that Imperfect has was the comparison to the chiseled bookshelf and the targeted slots being something that might be applied to a note block. The only issue with that, I would think, is that dividing a block in Minecraft into 6 slots is okay, but there's 18 or 21 different
25 possible notes. Yeah,
25 possible notes in a note block. That you get really granular there. That would be
Yes.
hard to specifically click unless you're doing like all, I guess not 6 sides, probably like 4 sides at the top, so 5 sides out of the note block. If that is what it was, then you could potentially get the right number of notes in there. But again, like that depends on whether you can see that side. It just becomes a whole other thing. So I feel like while the idea of having some sort of external GUI would be helpful, it may also be limiting because of the established functionality of the note block. I do think a GUI for note block is something that I've wanted forever, even if it is something as simple as indicating to the player what note you're on so that you only have to click like 4 more times to get to the right thing. Like getting feedback as to where you are in that 25 note range, I think is the first step. The next thing for me would be to actually have a GUI and allow players to program it by clicking it a specific thing. Because the thing about the round the horn mechanic for me, it really is one of the things that dates Minecraft. Like it feels very early,
Yeah.
like it really feels like something from a long time ago. And there's other things that have been implemented into Minecraft that have streamlined, still feel like Minecraft, but still work in a much friendlier way for the player. The stonecutter is the first thing that comes to mind, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And so I think comparing those is a decent way. And having something like that, like imagine, even if it's, because I would say that having a GUI for a note block would be more educational. Like if you put a piano keyboard, or if you put a grid of notes, or displayed in a way that somehow helps people even be more familiar with music, how the music notes are laid out, where they are in the scale, like that kind of thing visually, I think would be beneficial. And I know that you can add like texture packs and data packs that will change the display of the note block, little notes that float above it. I still feel like a point and click GUI would be better than the dial, because like the last time I had to go around the horn like that would have been on a television converter. And for people that don't know what that is, that would have been a digital remote channel changer that you'd have attached to a TV that did not have a remote, that had a dial on it, an old CRT, that you would have to change the dial to change the channels. And if you went digital, and if you went from channel 11 to channel 12, if you wanted to go back to channel 11, you had to go all the way around to go back to channel 11.
Yeah.
Yes, it dates me, but like it was that long ago, the last time I had to deal with that kind of mechanic. So to have it still in a video game in 2022, I find very, very strange.
Here is a counterpoint to that. Right-clicking on a note block is the way a lot of redstone contraptions have an input signal these days, because you end up tuning it. That's a block state change that can be detected by an observer, and that leads to the mechanism triggering. You can't do it just by playing the note block. So there's a couple of block state changes you can do, but tuning it by right-clicking on it is one option. So if right-clicking on it opens a GUI, then that nixes a lot of really neat little redstone interactions that it's possible to do with it. Obviously, you could shift-click on it, and that would be another option, but there are situations in which a player is going to be forced into sneaking and clicking on stuff, so there's some interesting like fringe use cases there that I think might have Mojang steering away from using a GUI element. And I feel like they also, historically speaking, they've tried to steer away from introducing GUIs, as we now see with the chiseled bookshelf. So here's my thinking. One of the things they could do with this is if they implemented some kind of note block tuner redstone component. Imagine like you've played bass guitar before, right? Did you ever use like an electric guitar tuner, like where you plug it in? Yeah, and it can show you that. So I wonder, what if it was like something about the size and shape of a redstone comparator, and you sort of plug that into the note block. You have it input into the note block, but the strength of the input signal tunes the note block without necessarily playing it. And then you could have some kind of visual interface there for what note it's playing. And the way you get around there being 25 possible notes and only 15 or 16 if you count 0 redstone signal strengths is that you have something like switching a comparator from additive mode to subtract mode by right-clicking on it, and that switches octave in the note block tuning. So there are like little ways you could do that, having like a note block tuner or a tuning fork or something like that as a component, which allows you to more automatically tune note blocks. And then what you could do with that is have a couple of neat ways of tuning a note block mid-song so that when the signal that's playing the note block loops back around, the note block has actually changed notes silently in the background, and then you could program a single note block to play one tune instead of having a whole string of them.
Right.
And that potentially gets you around some other things, like, for example, like the way note block sound is directional, and the further you get from a note block, the quieter the note becomes until you can't hear it anymore after a certain range. And if you want to play a larger song, you really have to pack it in tightly to a larger to an area. Otherwise, like I think I've seen videos of this in the past where players basically have to follow their note block song around a track on a minecart because they've got so much stuff going on there, and they're not reusing the same notes. They're playing all of the notes in sequence. So I think there's some really interesting like redstone problem-solving stuff that could be put into having a mechanism that tunes a note block on the fly for you, was what I came up with in response to this email.
I like the idea of taking your redstone and pushing it further. And I don't know if this is technically possible in game, but the one thing that I feel is missing I shouldn't say the one thing. One of the things I think is missing from note blocks in the game is the ability to have more than quarter notes, like having whole notes, half notes, like a longer held note.
Yeah,
And
sustaining notes, yeah.
Yeah, I think that having redstone perhaps powering the note block to a certain level could affect, like if it's between 1, 2, 3, and 4, could affect the length of the held note.
Sure.
That could be really interesting. But that then, like, that kind of counters what you would be doing. So maybe there's another way, whether it's having the block on top of something, having, I guess it would depend on Minecraft's ability to detect blocks below it. So if you put glass under a note block with one block, then it's a single note. But if you put 4 blocks of glass under a note block, then it would be a longer sustained note of that, whatever that musical instrument is. I think it's the wind chime or something like that for glass.
Yeah.
But like, I feel like there's some ways that they could make the note blocks more robust in game and allow players to get really creative and inventive. I know some players that are very technically minded and musical and would have an absolute field day getting into like more robust note block changes. I just don't know if they implement those changes, if they would then have to add some sort of GUI somehow to just make it not be as tedious, to go around. Because I know I see what you're saying with the redstone powering it to change it, but again, you're still dealing with like laying down a lot of redstone. The good news is there, like if you have to change something, you have a visual of either how much redstone is being laid down visually in the ground, or you've got a chest and a comparator, and you've got like, well, for example, like the new chisel bookshelves, like that would be fairly easy in terms of like, getting your power output. I mean, I guess it depends. If you wanted to leave the books in so you could visually see what the note was, great. But if you're using the same technique that you were using on your Copper David machine, then you'd have to remember what note block you left at 1 and 3 and 5 and 6 and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but then you could have hoppers adding and removing books from the bookshelves.
Oh, yeah.
It has this really neat Rube Goldberg snowball effect of like, what can you do by tweaking the pitch remotely? You end up with something like Look Mum No Computer, who we've kind of mentioned a couple of times on the podcast now, with like having all sorts of different contraptions that play the music in a seemingly analog way instead of having to reproduce it digitally. Going back to the heart of this question, though, the notes are block states, and people have used them for a variety of alternate textures and stuff. So I figured surely there was a resource pack somewhere out there which displays the note on the texture itself, and there is. If you go to vanillatweaks.net, of course, go to the utility tab under resource packs, there is a pack called Visual Note Block Pitch, which adds 2 screens to the note block, one with the tune number and one with the pitch. So it's a lot easier for people who are either, musicians who will understand what the letters and pitches correspond to, or just how many times you've right-clicked on it will show up on there for you. So if you're struggling with note blocks and you want to give that a try, it's a very easy resource pack. It's not going to be something you need to install server-side or anything. I reckon that will be worth using. But the default feature of if that was a default feature of the texture, though, it reduces their utility as a building block, which I think is probably why Mojang is resistant to changing that texture on like a vanilla level.
I am now remiss that I have not been using the multiple textures of a note block in my medieval build.
No, I think I saw Germsy Boy do this ages ago, where you can have a variety of different like crates and barrels and stuff like that. Back in the day, before barrels were even a thing, I think people were doing that in like 1.13. So there's a lot of different options for something that has 25 separate block states.
I have just a single crate, right? And
yeah.
I was thinking, like, even if I was to add a couple more crates, you'd have to be careful, because like when someone comes through without the texture pack, then or the resource pack or data pack, depending on how complicated it would have to be, then it would just be a bunch of either regular crates everywhere, or it would get too... I often battle with that. Like if it's got 25 different options, that kind of opens up a sky's the limit of like how many cool things could I put in Minecraft, to the point where just it wouldn't even look like vanilla Minecraft anymore. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a slippery slope. Let's move on to Kokoradaki's email. This is email number 2. It comes in from Kokoradaki, a longtime correspondent and landscape artist member of our Discord. The subject is peaceful options for the End and Elytra. Hi folks, the discussion on recent episodes around changes to peaceful mode have got me thinking. The main thing stopping players on peaceful from getting to the end is the lack of blaze rods, right? I like the suggestion in episode 220 to add them to the loot tables for nether fortresses, but I had another idea. How would you feel about Mojang adding settings in world generation to make all end portals generate already lit? This would allow peaceful players to get to the end without having to go to the nether first, which I know can be a scary place for some players even on peaceful. It would break the game progression just a little, but considering there's not much else to get from the nether for progression's sake aside from nether wart for anyone who wants to brew potions, I don't really think skipping the nether is a big deal. In addition to this, what if there was an option to have all end gateways around the main end island already generated? With no way for peaceful players to get ghast tiers, exploring the end with only one gateway after killing the dragon could be a huge pain, so having the gateways already generated could save players a lot of work. All that aside, since there's no way for the players to get an abundant source of gunpowder, I think the lack of firework rockets would be the next limiting factor for peaceful players, and unless they're willing to learn the old technique of using a punch 2 bow to pick up speed, I'm not so sure the elytra would actually get much use beyond gliding down from high points. Kokorodaki died because he forgot to make sure his punch 2 flying bow didn't have power 5 on it. I remember those days. That was Hermitcraft Season 4, I think. They kind of started using that punch bow technique, and you just see them flying around or landing at each other's bases full of arrows. Like absolute pincushion. Porcupine, Etho, or whoever would like land at somebody's base, and it was not a great look. I'm so happy they implemented firework boosting at the end of the day.
I'm so used to it now. Like I forget when I play an early game Minecraft, like if I go into a snapshot, I'm just like, oh, right, I don't have elytra. I can't just jump off of something and glide down.
Yeah, yeah.
As much as I like taking off with them, it's usually like the jumping off of something and not having to climb down slowly that I really miss and have to remind myself, especially if it's one of the reasons why I've not tried hardcore. So like I know that it's not going to be a mob that kills me. It's going to be me jumping off of something.
Yeah.
And not realizing that I don't have boots on and I don't have an elytra, and then just like, well, that's the end of that hour and a half setup, you know?
For sure.
So I know that you've got some thoughts on this because we touched on it last week.
Yeah. So one point of order here. Nether wart is not the only thing you need to be able to brew potions. You still need blaze powder because that's the fuel for the brewing stand. And that's something that I think we take for granted in survival now, but for a while it wasn't the case, and then they added in blaze powder as a necessary ingredient. So regardless of whether or not the end portals are open, you need... You know, if you want to give players access to potions, then you'd need to have some access of blaze powder anyway. So even if they wanted to skip the nether and come back later, when they come back later, they're not going to have access to that area of the game. And I feel like giving players access to the end, but still not giving them access to potions, feels like a really odd compromise when one could so clearly lead to the other if you take the right approach. The other thing about world generation options is that they're all very well, but once again we have the issue that some players are going to toggle their world between difficulty settings. You're going to start the world on easy and then change it to peaceful later. And if it's a world generation setting that allows for the end portals to already be lit, you would have to commit to one or the other. So like from a baseline perspective, I think it's difficult to really gauge how people are using peaceful mode. I think that's one of the things it's tracking in the new telemetry settings that they've introduced with these most recent snapshots is what game mode you're using, what difficulty setting you have, and how long you play for. And that way they can get data on how many people are actually playing in peaceful and might benefit from stuff like this to begin with.
Yeah, I agree with you about the world generation thing. I think that as a difficulty toggle or something like that, I think it'd be better to provide in-game tools rather than seeing a toggle at will gen. Would the dragon be more painstaking to defeat? Yes, but the trade-off is that you're in peaceful mode and nothing is attacking you.
Yeah.
And so it's not harder. It's just going to take you longer. And I think that's kind of like it's the trade-off of like mining stuff manually versus doing a farm. Like, we always talk about the time in versus reward out. And I think that's the trade-off there. I do think that I like the suggestion of a way to get blaze rods or blaze powder via loot tables from last week more than something like a world gen toggle. But what I also think is missing, as Kokorodaki pointed out, are things like alternate either loot table finds for gas tiers, or the gunpowder recipe. If there was an alternate way to get gunpowder, then even if it's harder, again, it's the same thing. Is it harder to get gunpowder in peaceful? Yes, with this new recipe, but the trade-off is, again, you don't have to worry about creepers blowing up your stuff. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's kind of like that back and forth. I think one of the other suggestions that we had was also like having aggressive mobs in the game, but just not be aggressive. And then that you could still do creeper farms, but you just wouldn't have to deal with the explosions. But I guess that's the other thing too, is that we had those tweaks to creepers as well, where you can do it either with a data pack, or there was also more like settings toggles where you could change the creepers to like just not blow up your stuff, or not kill you, or vice versa. You could set them to do whichever. And so there are things like that. But I guess one of the things, I mean, that kind of all points towards like data packs and those kind of things, when really the question is about like vanilla Minecraft. Like, what settings should vanilla Minecraft have to make peaceful mode more accessible? And I agree that I don't think that the end portals should be pre-lit, but I like the idea of having an alternate loot table system or alternate recipe system for some things. And I would be okay with that alternate recipe for something like gunpowder being available in all modes, right? Mm-hmm. And just have one be like creeper farm is one way, but if you want to play survival with your friends, but you really don't like mobs and creepers, well, then you'd have the available, I'm not sure what it would be, coal and some other thing to make gunpowder, you know what I mean? But you'd have to dig it up manually.
Yeah.
Or, borrow it from someone's wither skeleton farm.
Yeah, if you are interested in playing peaceful mode and you still want to get to the end, there are seeds out there that have a fully lit end portal as part of it. And I know this because I've taken a peripheral interest in Minecraft speedruns in the past, and the current set seed world record speedrun, which is less than 2 minutes, takes place in a world where a stronghold portal is already lit, and you effectively spawn yourself into a village which has enough obsidian, or you can get enough obsidian from the surrounding environment, that you go to the nether through a nearby ruined portal. You build another portal that takes you directly to the stronghold, and then seconds later you're just in the end portal, because you know exactly where to go to get to the portal room. And it is entirely possible that there's basically a percentage chance for each of the portal blocks around the end portal to be filled already with an Eye of Ender. And in most worlds, the odds just aren't in your favor for getting a fully lit end portal, but it's not an impossibility. So if you look into seeds that have pre-lit end portals, I'm sure there are plenty of places that you can find that online. If nothing else, just go to one of the Minecraft speedrunning discords and ask for that seed that they use for that specific world, and you'd be able to do it. So I think the world generation option idea also affects stuff like speedrunners. And if your main concern is how quickly you can beat the game, you can effectively just roll a bunch of seeds with that same idea, that same kind of pre-lit end portal everywhere notion, and then it completely opens up that to more seeds than just the set seed that they use currently. So I feel like there are some things that shouldn't necessarily be part of vanilla world generation options, because it sort of makes it less fair for people who are doing the slightly fringe ways of playing the game, like speedrunning. Mm-hmm. Moving on, though, let's do our November roundtable. We each decided to bring a different discussion topic for a shorter discussion each this week. I guess you'll go first. Why don't you go first? These are both kind of peripherally related to stuff that we've already talked about, but I think yours is maybe a little bit more of a segue from the news and stuff that we talked about earlier.
And a little bit shorter, too, I think. I want to give props, of course, to Mojang for the clarity of communication on expectations on 1.20 and 1.19.3, and the early communication that they've been separating separating major and minor updates. But I have been having trouble keeping things straight. And I do a co-hosted Minecraft news show.
Yeah.
weekly. And this came into my mind this morning as I was talking with Steven on the way home from the gym, and I was explaining the differences between the two. And it could have been that we were both tired from the gym, but his eyes were glazing over. And I was just like,
Yeah.
he's savvy. Like, he's a Minecraft player. He streams. I think that there is a little bit of I don't want to say confusion, but it's the keeping things straight. Like, I understand that there are some flagship features from Minecraft Live, like chisel bookshelves, hanging signs, Campbell's and bamboo, that are not coming in 1.20, right? Like, I remember that, but I don't remember exactly what's coming in 1.19.3. And I think some of the problem comes from the way that they're being tested. So you download one snapshot for 1.19.3, but you have a 1.20 data pack that you can then apply to that. And so you can still play the 1.19 snapshot, but then also have the experimental features. And again, calling them experimental features is a great way to say, this is not 100%. Don't get married to this because it might change. But I think that it may be, and this is me saying this without the understanding of how technically difficult it would be behind the scenes, I'm wondering if they should maybe have two separate snapshots, like one for 1.19.3 and one for 1.20.
Yeah.
Because I get them convoluted. Now, in some situations, they've done a pretty good job of separating things out into separate articles. The note block mob head was a separate article that came out like just after our show one week, ahead of the snapshot. And I was like, hey, here's this new thing. It's going to be a 1.20 feature. We're looking at implementing it. Let's test this out. And it's going to be included in the next snapshot experimental features. But it's not such a big deal. Like, it's not a hanging sign. It's not a camel, so you don't look at it like, oh, wow, that's fantastic. You kind of think like maybe that should be something that could be implemented in 1.19.3. And
yeah. I feel like where the waters have been muddied a little bit here as well is that in the pre-release for 1.19.3, we got that play ahead note block sound change, which is a change that's being applied to a feature that we're not getting until 1.20.
Exactly.
But that's being released in a pre-release for this update. And so it implies that anything that's in a pre-release changelog is going to be going in to 1.19.3, which, as far as we are aware, isn't the case. Azuma mentioned this in his video on the subject as well, so this was also on my mind, and it was a really good thing that you decided to bring this up.
And I find too that once you get to the actual snapshot, like if you look at the previous snapshot, I think it was 46A, there is here are some things that are, changes in 1.20, but then right after that, there is the changes that are happening in the 1.19.3, but there's not a big bullet. Like, they need a graphical separation, I think, in even the news article, because ultimately, because it's a data pack that's included in the snapshot, it's one article that lists all the features when the snapshot actually comes out, as opposed to separating things out into two separate articles. And so, again, I know that they're doing their best to communicate clearly that these things are separate. And I am not confused that they are not separate. I'm just having trouble remembering what's happening in 1.19.3 and 1.20. It's also a mouthful of numbers to just like to get your head around or your tongue around. But then on top of that, a lot of the features which are welcome in 1.19.3 are either bug fixes or sweeping technical changes, like the predicate stuff, the telemetry data, like all this kind of stuff. It's the kind of thing that we truncate greatly on the news show read because it's so complicated. And after a while, even as you read it, your brain just kind of fuzzes over and like you're just regurgitating syntax and setups and variants and all that kind of stuff. And it's a lot. I don't want to dismiss the level of update that 1.19.3 is. I'm just saying that because of the heart emoji gobbledygook that I'm seeing in the notes, because I don't understand a lot of the back end stuff, I find it difficult to then remember what is in 19.3. So I'm wondering two things. The kind of elevator pitch is like, do we need a 1.20 and a 1.19.3 snapshot separately, or do these minor updates from Mojang need just one flagship thing, like one new feature? I'm not saying that it should have bamboo or hanging signs this time around, but I'm saying like something that could be brought in new that would be small, but would still allow people to say, oh yeah, the note block update versus the bamboo bookshelf update. Like just because people ultimately stop assigning the 1.20 and they start thinking about it as like whatever is the most prominent feature, right?
Yeah. I think this is where having it be a single long changelog article kind of doesn't work in Mojang's favor. And
Agreed.
watching creators, even, employees like Slice Lime making videos about some of these changes really helps to clarify things. And I'd be surprised if there is anybody out there in the community who is just reading the paper changelogs and isn't getting some kind of video demonstration or diving in for themselves to see what's there and what isn't in each of these. But I do think it's a shame in a way that so many websites these days have just defaulted to everything being one long scroll, probably because it's easier to read on a phone or something like that, because you could have two columns, and in column A would be the 1.19.3 stuff and the stuff that was specifically pertinent to that, and in column B could be 1.20, and that's all you would need. But yeah, I totally agree. I think the new approach to minor updates has made it difficult to determine which changes are going to be arriving in the .3 release and which are arriving in the big major update release. It also doesn't help that 1.20 doesn't have a name yet, so the only thing we can refer to it as is 1.20. And after a while, we just feel like we're reading numbers in order. We're just going 19, 20, 21. It's a bit of a mess right now, and I think the mess is largely because we're dealing with pre-releases at this stage for an upcoming dot release. We're kind of clustering all of our thoughts around that instead of looking towards a big, like, tentpole flagship release in future. And that's just the nature of the way they've split things up. I do think both Mojang and the community are going through a learning experience right now about communication. And like you said, the first part of that has been accomplished very well, and that's the setting of expectations, not revealing features before they are ready for players to play around with, and setting expectations for this may still not make it to the update because these features are experimental. I think what's lacking currently and what can still be improved upon, if we can learn from these experiences, is how they communicate the distinction between minor releases and major releases in these larger changelog articles. I think that's the textual communication of that stuff still has a bit of a way to go, but I think it's going to get there. It'll just take a bit of time.
And the other thing that I just thought of, we've talked about perhaps the naming convention on the major updates for Minecraft losing the word update from the title. Rather than the Deep Dark update, it could just be called the Deep Dark. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And if doing that, so the major update is called the Deep Dark. But then these 0.1, 2, and 3s could be the Deep Dark Update 1, the Deep Dark Update 2. And that's a lot easier to keep straight, just verbally. Now, all the same things that you just mentioned totally apply. You'd still have to figure out how to separate out all the little granular things. But even visually on their Minecraft.net articles, like I'm looking at the Minecraft 1.19.3 pre-release 2. And it's got piglins on note blocks. Piglin heads on note blocks. Like that's not coming until 1.20. So like it's the visual art is different than the actual thing that they're talking about. So like I think that is some of the little nuance that you don't notice right away, but then when I recall the article, like I remember the art at the top. It's like, yeah, but that's not in the update.
Yeah. I think with regards to the Deep Dark Update 1, Deep Dark Update 2, they might have shot themselves in the foot a little bit by having to split the Caves and Cliffs update, which, for the record, I still think was the correct decision. But there are already so many jokes about, like, 1.19 being the Caves and Cliffs update part 3 because it added the Deep Dark. I kind of worry that the cynical side of the Minecraft audience is going to take that meme and run with it and then be like, oh, well, this is just like Caves and Cliffs part 4 then, that kind of thing. So I worry about that stuff. And they probably shouldn't be making their decisions based on people just making meme jokes, but there you go. Like these are people with their finger on the pulse, hopefully, of what the player base wants. So I think they're eventually going to arrive at a way of communicating this that is better for everyone. It's just still they're still in a position where they're learning what that is.
Yeah, I agree.
So, talking about the sound of the new updates, let's talk about the sounds in-game. That's kind of what I wanted to bring to the table this week. With more blocks getting unique sounds in recent updates, we're kind of now at the position where we're getting more control over the soundscape of our bases instead of just the visual effect of the materials that we're using. And I wanted to start a conversation about detail beyond just texture, detail in the audio environment as well, and how much do we or should we consider this when building? I'll start with a question for you, Joel. How much have you built with Amethyst since it was released?
Not very much. I think there's a little bit of Amethyst in my copper zombie farm because it's next to a geode. And I had to mine out a bunch of Amethyst to make it, a viable Amethyst crystal farm. But then I also decided to decorate a little bit with it, but I don't think I'm walking on it.
Yeah.
But I've seen it used where you want to like build it so that you can walk around on it and then maybe hide it underneath a carpet so that you don't, it just sounds like magical sounds are happening when you're walking along. It doesn't actually give you the visual cue that you're on Amethyst,
Yeah. No, I think I'm still looking for places where I can use Amethyst that way. I've seen it happen a couple of times. I think in one of Iskel's, I think maybe the Season 8 Hermitcraft base, he added some Amethyst under moss carpet in a more green environment, and it still it felt like magical grotto vibes, and I think that was a really neat way of using it. And I'm still looking for places where I can make some additions like that to an area. Around my base on Empires, I've been mixing mud and mud bricks into the paths that lead around, which also have stone bricks, and grass. And the sound of my footsteps is changing constantly. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a really neat way of letting the player know where they are and what kind of environment they're walking around, because I imagine as you walk around West Hill, you just get the same footstep sounds pretty much everywhere because you're walking on stone and stone bricks and andesite and like all the different kind of decorative stone types at that point. But then if you walk around my ruins, there's a different soundscape to being there, and it feels a little bit more overgrown just auditorily. Whereas if you go down into the catacombs, then you're walking on stone constantly, and the environment sound changes. I was also spending a lot of time in a nether fortress working on this with a skeleton farm, and I really like the changes they have made to the sounds of nether bricks. The fact that you can walk on them and they sound different, you break them and they sound different to breaking stone bricks in the overworld. I think nether blocks in general have their own soundscape now. You think about mining basalt and blackstone, and those all have different sound effects too, and I think it really helps the nether feel like a more complete experience, especially after the 1.16 changes, adding biomes and everything, but also adding to the soundscape of the nether, ambient sounds playing a part of that, but also the active sounds playing a part of that. The Foley of the nether, if you like, is really solid. And so I'm hoping that that's a trend that continues, and I want to draw people's attention to it as an opportunity to bring a soundscape into your base and start to use that as a means of guiding the player around. I was looking at this in the later episodes of Survival Guide Season 2, where I was trying to guide players' experience and have like alcoves to go off into the side walls of a cave, but also guide players along a critical path by laying it with cobblestone. So you follow the more textured looking blocks in order to get down to the elevator that's going to take you to the next level. And another way you could approach that is to effectively say, if you're still hearing the tinkle sounds of you walking on Amethyst, then that means you're following the critical path through this area and you're going in the right direction. You can use that idea even for mazes. If your maze is completely floored in carpet, you can give the player a subtle clue to the fact they're going in the right direction from the fact that if they walk off the correct path, the amethyst sound under their feet could stop. And I think there's a lot of different ways to do that I'm trying to work out where I can make those distinctions and what's really going to help.
It's really interesting because since I started using it a while ago, I've turned it off, but I used to use a mod called Mambience on the Citadel several of us were using it specifically for like footstep noises, and I really liked the extra air whoosh that it gave you when you were using your elytra. I ended up turning it off because I found it very distracting. But I think that is part of the thing where I don't know how much this has changed because it's been several game versions since I've used it. But I usually find with this kind of mod that it's either all or nothing. And it's kind of hard to, they don't give you enough granular control to like turn off certain blocks or turn off footsteps or whatever. And I remember, I think I ended up turning off the footsteps, but I kept everything else. Because I'm the kind of person that really enjoys, like, if I'm playing a mod pack and there's like echo in the cave, or if you've got like extra wind or weather noises or things like that. Birds in forests, we've talked about that on the show before, and that kind of thing in Ambience was really, really cool. But very often you don't have the control that you have if you're doing something like Amethyst or messing around with like having dirt blocks or planks or wood in different places. And I agree with you. I having just heard you go over it now, you're right. The Nether has a very unique, very all-encompassing kind of like everything in there has a very different feel. It reminds me of like when you're walking through like a Crimson Forest, there's all that like squeaky crunching under your foot. Like it's kind of like that weird kind of foliage squeak that happens. And it feels alien. It feels very weird. And it gives you the impression of this is not super solid what I'm standing on. Like it kind of, it's squishy. And I like that. I think Skulk does the same thing.
Yeah, Skulk. I've had a lot of experience walking on that lately, Joel. And yeah, it's definitely got that kind of like squishy, fungusy kind of sound to it as part of the ambient footstep sound. Yeah.
It always reminds me of that scene from Empire Strikes Back when they get out on the asteroid and they're inside the asteroid monster.
And they're inside the kind of space worm thing. Yeah,
they're standing on a tongue and they're like, "What is the ground so squishy?" Like that kind of stuff. And I think that's really cool. But by doing more with it in game and giving the players the control, I think the only thing there is that it's tough when it's a cool noise with a block that you can't always use, and therefore you have to cover it with carpet, like Amethyst. I like Amethyst and I like the noise it makes, but I'm not always going to want the shiny, sparkly purple block in the floor,
Yeah.
So I kind of wonder whether they could increase, because I know, for example, if you put soul sand under a plank, you still feel the effects of the soul sand, right? You still walk slow.
Yeah, but you're
because
still...
I've made that design error. I've made that design error in my nether paths. I remember I was running away from a ghast and all of a sudden I got real slow. I was like, what's going on? I'm on cobblestone. But then, of course, the inside of the path happens to be filled with soul sand for visuals from the side. But it also, that effect goes through the slab. So I'm wondering if they could extend the noises to go through slabs as well, if that would give players more ability to have different noises underfoot, but then also have different visuals on the top,
Yeah, and it's certainly an option. And one of the things that really excites me about the new mob and play ahead note block stuff is that there is now an opportunity for players to not have to worry too much about materials, because with a little bit of cheeky note block technology and some player detection, whether by Skulk sensors or by other means, you can kind of import your own soundscape. If you've got, let's say, the Vanilla Tweaks mini block player heads, if you grab those from the Wandering Trader or however you manage to get them, they could be a really neat way of expanding on the soundscape of your base without making compromises on building material. If one of those Amethyst mini blocks on a note block nearby plays chimes occasionally when players are around, despite them not actually walking on Amethyst blocks. It could also be a way to totally confuse players if you wanted it to be. Like, imagine walking around a base and hearing note block sounds of somebody else's footsteps nearby, to the left or to the right or something. It could be quite creepy if you use it in specific ways, but I do think there is opportunity for players to have a bit more raw control over that without having to compromise on materials. And so with this note block like player head change, if players want to implement it a certain way, they're really going to get the best of both worlds. They'll be able to add to the soundscape of their base whilst still keeping all of the materials the way that the aesthetics the way they want them to look.
I like the idea of having that controlled environment, because the first thing that I thought of was like, walking in the front door of an old creepy mansion build and having that door function trigger a note block somewhere that plays like a flight of bats, like fluttering out of the belfry because they've been startled by your approach in the house.
Yeah.
And you hear that in films all the time. You see it in video games all the time where like there's a planned situation where you're sneaking around and you're trying to get into a base and they've purposely put a flock of birds in your path that are going to fly up and cause a bunch of ruckus. And you're going to be like, oh gosh, like I just made a lot of noise. Did the bad guys see me? And it's not really meant to trigger the bad guys. It's just meant to make you feel like, ooh, I should
put
really
you on
keep
edge.
quiet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, like it's meant to affect your experience. And I think that would be really handy and really fun to do in Minecraft because you could do a lot of the things that would be very complicated to add in game, from like adding a block that makes a noise or adding a thing, a mob that makes a noise, being able to add sounds of those things, like having squirrels chirping and birds chirping in a forest on note blocks is way easier to do than adding birds and squirrels into Minecraft. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I would love to have the ambient noises of the dodos in my like froglight tree area on Empires without the dodos needing to physically be there, as though they're just kind of through the trees on the opposite side. And I'd probably have to do a bit of funky sound design to actually make the dodos noises, because right now they just sound like horses, which they are. But there you go. That's where we're going to leave this episode of the Spawn Chunks, folks. But, consider the sound of your base this week. You can find more information about our show and links to some of the stuff that we've talked about today at thespawnchunks.com. The music for the show is composed by me. The Spawn Chunks is proud to be a listener-supported podcast. If you're getting some value out of the show, why not consider putting some value back in? You can visit patreon.com/thespawnchunks to join our community, where pledging at any level will get you an invite to the patrons-only Discord chat. You can participate in the live show recording as it happens every week. You can listen in. And our monthly Minecraft audio hangout for December may be rescheduled, but you'll be able to participate in future ones if you stick around. We're currently at 340 patrons, which is steady on from last week. Special thanks go out to our content engineers, Hunter555, Jumbo Sale, and Yitz for your support on this episode.
Sharing the podcast with your friends is the easiest way to support the show. You can find us at The Spawn Chunks on Twitter and Instagram. Personal recommendations are by far the best way to share the podcast. Just poke a friend in the arm from a safe distance, tell them about The Spawn Chunks, and they can find it on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and even YouTube. Be sure to leave a rating and a review on your favorite platform. You can also email the show at spawnchunkmail@gmail.com. Find the RSS feed on the spawnchunks.com, and find the patron-only RSS feed on the Patreon page. That's where you can listen to the render distance, the extended version of the podcast.
My name is Johnny, but online I go by Pixelriffs. You can find most of what I do at youtube.com/Pixelriffs, where Empires SMP and Hermitcraft are still in the midst of an epic collaboration. I also stream 3 days a week on Twitch, doing behind-the-scenes work for my YouTube series, and I'm the voice of the unofficial Hermitcraft recap, which you can find through a quick YouTube search. Aside from that, I'm at Pixelriffs on both Twitter and Instagram. Joel, where can people find you online?
Everything I'm doing online can be linked through joelduggan.com, or just search Joel Duggan on your favorite platform. The Citadel Cafe is my other podcast about sci-fi and fantasy entertainment. That is at, you guessed it, thecitadelcafe.com, or your favorite podcast app. Had Alistair on last week. We talked more about The Crown, and we talked about one of the biggest Lego builds that I've seen in a long time. The tallest Lego build right now is the Lego Eiffel Tower. So we dug into that a little bit. You can follow me at Joel Duggan on social media, and of course Joel Duggan on Twitch, where I am pushing a lot of Minecraft lately, trying to get more work done on West Hill.
Thanks for visiting the Spawn Chunks. The world outside is infinite, and that sounds good to me.